What is world literature? Thank you for tuning in to The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. Today, we'll talk about the general landscape of world literature. We will begin by asking what is world literature, how it's been developed as an independent academic discipline, as well as major debates surrounding the field. Here are a few simple but interesting questions to begin our inquiry. What does comparative literature study? Does it apply the same approaches as a certain national literature does? Why do we need to compare? And more importantly, how to compare? Even though these questions are all too familiar to professors and researchers of literature, the truth is they're not that easy to answer, as approaches to literature always evolve around the debates that are constantly shifting and developing. One thing we can claim for certain is that, due to the institutional nature of comparative literature, it did not succeed in explaining itself with vernacular expression. According to the trenchant observation by the editors at N+1, which is a radical literary magazine, that comparative literature is in fact a manifestation of the eliteness of our higher education, literally driven by what Edward Said observes as a kind of narcissism that attempts to separate itself from the piecemeal of the globalized and capitalized quiche. With this critical awareness in mind, today we will also look into major arguments of Edward Said, David Damrosch, and Emily Abeder, to name just a few. Another interesting question is whether global literature is truly global. We will address this question with Dr. Ben Hutchinson, professor of European literature at University of Kent. To begin with, David Damrosch has warned us that comparative literature has been much of an American design in the past, one that aligns with its ideology. Does this mean that comparative literature has always been elite, narcissistic, and hegemonic? Well, at least the suggested readings for today's episode manifest an ideal legacy from Marxism and a self-consciousness towards forming its own institutional discourse. This is, of course, the brighter side of comparative literature, as it has always been keenly aware of the hubris of monolingualism by acknowledging English as a potentially hegemonic language in constructing the modern Tower of Babel. What about the dark, negative side? Well, both Emily Abeder and David Damrosch have retrospective contemplations on world literatures in the past, and they both develop new visions towards what a world literature should be in the future, just as the editors at N+1 captures very well of their views.
Today's world literature might be better called global literature. World calls up aspirations to true universality. We are the world, while global, through no fault of its own, evokes phenomena like global capitalism and global warming, the good and bad effects of which are by no means universally felt. Global, in other words, implies worldwide processes that polarize the conditions of the world's people, including, presumably, their literary condition. Through globalization, the US and China can become equally unequal. Writers aren't to be blamed for this situation, or not much. The question is what we make of it. Global literature can't help but reflect global capitalism in its triumph, inequalities, and deformations. World literature was not often called that when there were still three worlds. First, capitalist. Second, Soviet-style socialist. And third, could go either way. The key institution in the creation of world literature has not been the literary festival or even the commercial publishing house, but the university. Universities began to hire and promote writers from the global south around the time that the national liberation movements failed, prompting many to flee abroad. The university even more quickly became basic to the careers of young writers. You can see this in the way it suddenly intrudes like a dissonant chord in the sophomore work of world lit authors, the trace of the moment when they took their first teaching job. The university always threatens to insulate world lit from the world it wants to describe and address. World literature, in the form gestured at by Goethe, and now canonized by the Academy, has become an empty vessel for the occasional self-ratification of the global elite, who otherwise mostly ignore it.
What this means is that, like the Olympic Games, world literature is being criticized for putting on a utopian gesture, as it is not political enough for daily practices and addressing inequality of race, class, and gender. This comment also highlights the subtleties in defining world literature. In his 2003 monograph, What is Literature?, Damrosch refers to world literature as, quote, encompassing all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, in their translation or in their original language. Well, here he's referring to the fact that people still read Virgil in Latin. In its most expansive sense, world literature could include any work that has ever reached beyond its home base, that is within a literary system, beyond that of its original culture, unquote. Damrosch further highlights a few key characteristics pertaining to world literature. First, it has to exert in itself a mode of circulation, and in the process of circulation that is mainly achieved through translation, it gains elevated and multifocal ways of interpretation. To use Damrosch's expression, quote, in which a certain work of world literature can be best read, unquote. And this is why translation studies in the US has gained so much valence, as translation theory itself not only examines linguistic communications when a certain work crosses its border, it also reflects on the philosophy of meaning and representation. The Algerian-born French philosopher Jacques Derrida calls translation as the act of literature, referring to the fact that meanings and interpretations suddenly begin to take on an elevated level through and by translation. Derrida illustrates this idea through his famous essay on translation called What is a Relevant Translation? There is a fascinating play with the pun relevant because it is also a French word, but with quite different meanings. What Derrida is doing here is to play with more than one meaning of the word relevant in order to come up with more than one realization. On the one hand, as the English word suggests, a relevant translation aims at achieving the most equivalent or relevant meaning expressed in the original. An ideally relevant translation does not emphasize on a verbatim translation, neither does it point at a loose translation, but the secret of achieving a true relevancy here lies in understanding a word in its polysemic meanings. While some languages by nature is polysemic, like French, it is also true that when comparing with another language, meanings multiply and understandings deepen. For example, in French, relevant is a gerund signifying a state of being, which should be translated into either seasoning with ingredients or elevating into a higher level, a concept that is certainly derivative of Hegel's sublation. It is in this playful and creative fashion that Derrida argues for an elevated version of the original. Through the process of comparing with more than one language, literature, and culture, meanings begin to take on new form, just as the meaning of lifting up and seasoning with ingredients occupy the center of Derrida's vision of what an ideal translation should be. For more information, please read Derrida's essay on What is a Relevant Translation, and you won't regret it. The second nature of world literature, according to Damrosch, is that the work in question has to be a masterpiece. So, what is a masterpiece and what makes a masterpiece different from a classic? As Damrosch writes on page 15 of What is World Literature has often been seen in one or more of the three ways as an established body of classics, as an evolving canon of masterpieces, or as multiple windows on the world. The classics is a work of transcendent, even foundational value, often identified particularly with Greek and Roman literature, so taught today in departments of classics and often closely associated with imperial values, as Frank Kermode has shown in his book, The Classic. The masterpiece, on the other hand, can be an ancient or a modern work and not have had any foundational cultural force. Goethe certainly considers his own best works and those of his friends to be modern masterpieces. The masterpiece indeed came to prominence in the 19th century as literary studies began to de-emphasize the dominant Greco-Roman classics, elevating the modern masterpieces to a level of near quality with long-established classics. In this literary analog of a liberal democracy, the often middle-class masterworks could engage in a great conversation with their aristocratic forebears, a conversation in which their culture and the class of origin mattered less than the great ideas they expressed anew. Finally, Goethe's disquisition on Chinese novels and Serbian poems show a nascent interest in works that will serve as windows into foreign lands. Whether or not these works could be construed as masterpieces, and regardless of whether these different worlds had any visible links to each other at all. The third characteristic of world literature, according to Damrosch, is its nuanced and localized cosmopolitanism. As Damrosch quotes Bruce Robbins, no one actually is or ever can be a cosmopolitan in the sense of belonging nowhere. The interest of the term cosmopolitanism is located then not in his theoretical extension, where he becomes a paranoid fantasy of ubiquity and omniscience, but rather paradoxically in his local applications. For more details on this third aspect of world literature and how it applies to a certain literary work, one can refer to our forthcoming episode on the Tale of Ganji with Professor Edward Kamens at Yale University. A fourth nature of world literature is its inevitable gain and loss in the process of translation. In particular, works of old literature take on new life as they move into the world at large. And to understand this new life, we need to look closely at the ways the work becomes reframed in its translations and in its new cultural context. Walter Benjamin calls this process as Nachleben, which means the afterlife of a work. Finally, let's hear how European scholars contemplate on the nature of comparative literature.
My name is Ben Hutchinson. I'm Professor of European Literature at the University of Kent. I'm going to talk to you today about comparative literature. What do you see in the ink plot? Some see an abstract cloud. Others, some form of menacing mask. Some see the suggestive spaces. Others focus on the lines that shape them. We can presumably all agree that the two sides of the image are symmetrical. But beyond that, our brains process the information differently, projecting associations and prejudices, and hopes and fears, onto a shifting, undefined object. The image, in other words, is only as revealing as the observer. Impressionistic as it is, Hermann Rorschach's inkplot test offers an instructive analogy for comparative literature. Understood as the reciprocal study of at least two forms of writing, comparative literature is both the most natural and the most constructed of intellectual activities. As we struggle to make sense out of one text or tradition, we instinctively compare it to another text or tradition. One side of the object mirrors and shapes the other. Cover half of the image behind me, and it quickly loses any form of structure. Yet we also bring a whole set of political, historical, and cultural predispositions to the comparison, a perceptual apparatus through which we conjure meaning as we compare it. To use one text to understand another, to read Shakespeare's The Tempest alongside Montaigne's essay on cannibals, for instance, or to compare Chinese poetry of the Tang period with European poetry of the modernist period, is to reveal something about one's own tastes and knowledge, if only the belief that there is something meaningful to be learned through contextualizing one's own tastes and knowledge. Comparison clarifies, through its very methodology, that reading literature is also reading into literature. For literature exists, after all, comparatively. From the dramas of antiquity to the novels of modernity, from Eastern epics to Western classics, there is not a text in history that is truly self-sufficient. To read and to write is to work within an existing framework of characters, conventions, plots, and premises. How we understand one work of literature is contingent on how we understand another work of literature. The more we know, the more we contextualize. The more we learn, the more we compare. Knowledge itself is comparative. Beyond how we read, beyond how we write, comparison is hardwired into the very ways that we think. While this makes comparative literature among the most ambitious of intellectual disciplines, it also brings the whole undertaking into question. For if to read is to compare, in the pithy words of George Steiner, one of the most influential of contemporary comparatists, then fencing off a protected zone for its pursuit might, in fact, seem unnecessary, since we are constantly doing it anyway. What, to put it simply, is the force of comparative literature as opposed to that of literature? To answer this question requires delving into the practice, the history, and the theory of the discipline. Why, and indeed how, does one become a comparatist? In my case, it began with a passion for languages, then for the literatures written in them, and then for how to join the dots between them. The moment the dots start to cohere into a pattern is the moment at which literature becomes truly comparative, and it is amongst the most exhilarating of intellectual experiences. To follow the evolution of the novel from Cervantes to Calvino, to study the history of the sonnet from Petrarch to Pushkin, is to navigate by new and larger constellations, drawn on by the delight of making cross-cultural connections. Anyone naturally inquisitive, whether with or without foreign language skills, can share this satisfaction. Curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual ambition, these are the only prerequisites for making comparisons. Well, if there are a few more basic human instincts than the urge to compare, scholarly modes of comparison take this psychological drive and dignify it with disinterest. Yet the context of the observer continues to provide the crucial point of reference. Comparative literature may aspire to the objectivity of a discipline, but in reality it is deeply complicit in the prejudices and positions that define it. There is in fact no such thing as a single objective sense of comparative literature. Almost every comparatist has a different idea of how and what to compare. Almost every comparatist has a different set of priorities. The only consensus is on the inherent instability of the term. Like governments in a democracy, we have the modes of comparison that we deserve. This instability is the very essence of comparative literature. Both its meaning and its methodology depend on unsettling fixed canons, on forging fresh connections and mutually enriching links between disparate texts and traditions. Unlike the clearly demarcated fields of national literatures, English, French, Russian, etc., comparative literature does not have a canon of texts so much as a canon of approaches to texts. Comparative literature, in short, constitutes less a discipline than an indiscipline. If this makes it akin to a Rorschach test, it also makes it a mirror for modernity's intellectual anxieties regarding globalization. But what is comparative literature? Ambitious readers looking to stretch themselves are generally intrigued by the concept, but uncertain of its implications. And rightly so in many ways. Even the professionals cannot agree on a single term, calling it, to take just three examples, compared in French, littérature comparée, comparing in German, Vergleichen der Literaturwissenschaft, and comparative in English, where the French past participle suggests that the comparing has already happened, and the German present participle that it is in the process of happening. The English adjective blurs the distinction between object and observer. The very term itself, when considered comparatively, opens up a Pandora's box of cultural differences. Yet this, in a nutshell, is the whole point. To look at literature comparatively is to realize just how much can be learned by looking over the horizon of one's own tradition. It is to discover more not only about other literatures, but also about one's own, and it is to participate in the great utopian dream of understanding the way cultures interact. In an age that is paradoxically defined by migration and border crossing on the one hand, and by retreat into monolingualism and monoculturalism on the other, the cross-cultural agenda of comparative literature has become increasingly central to the future of the humanities. We are all, in fact, comparatists, constantly making connections across languages, cultures, and genre as we read. The question is whether we realize it. So the history and theory of comparative literature are the history and theory of how literary cultures have learned to view each other. The forces of modernity that give rise to the discipline, from colonialism and nationalism to exile and internationalism, are also the forces that shaped it, sculpting its project of analogy, antithesis, and cultural differentiation. Comparative literature, in short, constitutes something like the international relations of culture. In fact, one doesn't need to look only at the European version of comparative literature, and indeed one can go well beyond the merely modern version of comparative literature. The whole idea of European modernity, as we have increasingly learned over recent decades, is deeply problematic. Nonetheless, the discipline of comparative literature developed in European modernity, and to a large extent because of European modernity. So I think I'm going to concentrate just on that for today. Within modern Europe, then, the development of comparative literature as a process of intellectual exchange between nations looks back to the post-1648 idea of national sovereignty enshrined in the Treaty of Westphalia. To be international, first one has to be national. The principle of the balance of power, along with that of religious and by extension cultural freedom, ensured that the various empires and dominions began to pursue intercultural exchange in lieu of international war. By the 19th century, the era in which the discipline would develop in earnest, This balance of power was reasserted following the upheaval of the Napoleonic Wars by the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which fixed the European map for the next 100 years. The fact that the major empires, Prussia, Russia, Austria, had made major gains meant that numerous smaller states and languages were now subsumed within their purview. A range of differing cultures were housed within a handful of overarching groupings, the better to balance each other out at the supranational level. The conditions for comparison, one might say, were perfect. Yet for the emerging discipline of comparative literature, this imperial structure created a double bind, since it meant that attempts to overcome national divisions were tied precisely to those divisions, locked into a narrative of competing countries and colonies. Comparison developed, in short, within and between nations and empires, the Napoleonic, Victorian, the Habsburg, as much as within and between languages and literatures. Understood in the geopolitical terms of the 19th century, comparative literature was also competitive literature. Given such competing narratives, how can the process of comparing best be understood? Perhaps we might usefully begin by viewing it as the search for a master metaphor. The Belgian-born critic Paul de Man argued that modern literature constructs its own allegories of reading. Comparative literature, by extension, constructs metaphors of reading, models of how to interpret texts and cultures between languages and nations. Such metaphors may provisionally be broken down into two groups, those indicating connection or similarity, and those indicating disconnection or difference. Beginning with the former group, perhaps the most obvious metaphor for the comparative approach to literature is that of the crossroads. Standing at the center of any number of converging routes or spaces, the Silk Road, the Holy Roman Empire, the Enlightenment Republic of Letters, the comparatist surveys and directs the passing traffic. Such a position confers numerous advantages: constant stimulation and negotiation, exposure to competing perspectives, and privileged access to a range of sources. But it also risks being disorienting, placing the comparatist at the mercy of chance and circumstance, her head spinning furiously like the roadrunner in one of those cartoons where the traffic signs are all flipped around. An alternative, increasingly important model of negotiation is that of the marketplace. In an age in which successful authors write as much for an international as for a national audience, the cross-cultural marketability of literature has become a significant criterion in determining what gets compared, and indeed what gets written. Already in the 1820s, Goethe, in launching the term world literature, used the metaphor of the marketplace, partly in the Enlightenment sense of a forum for trade and commerce, partly in order to encourage the dissemination of his own works. Monetized in this way, the metaphor of the marketplace points towards the socio-cultural framework in which comparative literature necessarily operates, towards the network of publishers, reviewers, translators, and professors who make it possible. Metaphors such as crossroads and marketplace, as well as other more overtly political variations, such as Parliament or United Nations, facilitate interaction between two or more perspectives. Indeed, they mimic the very meaning of metaphor, just as the process of comparison functions as a simile, by saying that one thing is like another, so too it acts as a metaphor, from the Greek metapherein, meaning to carry over or transfer, indicating as it does the ways in which we compare one idea to another. Yet metaphors can be misleading. Sometimes meaning is not so much carried over as intercepted. The Danish critic Georg Brandes described comparative literature as a telescope that both magnifies and reduces, since it sees further, but only by focusing on specific objects. And the image neatly captures the ambivalent nature of both of comparison and of its attendant metaphors. How are we to understand those metaphors that call into question any easy sense of comparative literature as simply an intellectual import-export business? How are we to understand the mechanisms of difference as well as of similarity? What, in short, of what one might term contrastive literature? Contrastive literature forms the necessary counterpart to comparative literature. Without difference, no similarity. In order to say that one thing is like another, one must implicitly say what it is not like. To compare presupposes the ability to contrast. Seen in this way, comparative literature is as much about reconfiguring comparisons as making them, and accordingly it attracts a corresponding group of metaphors centered on the creation of new perspectives and meanings. Perhaps the most prominent metaphor in this group is that of the melting pot. Unlike the image of the crossroads, which suggests that texts and ideas may take different directions, but will still keep moving in some previously recognizable form, the linguistic melting pot, in pre-modernity, Latin or Sanskrit, in post-modernity, world literature in English or French, implies that local ideas undergo a fundamental change of form in order to find expression within the many variations of one global recipient. Of course, comparison even within one language is not this straightforward. A single pot can contain a multitude of ingredients that it is the role of the comparatist to taste and identify. Locating the border between one version of an idea and another, bringing them together, but also keeping them apart, is an essential aspect of comparative practice. If the model of the melting pot dissolves conflicting elements as much as it solves them, the idea of comparative literature as a border point invests the comparatist with greater powers still, for it suggests that she can just as well block the traffic of ideas as allow them safe passage, that she is authorized to rifle through texts in search of contraband content, such as, for instance, vestigial colonialism in modern European literature. The comparatist sits in judgment on the flow of ideas, with a more or less liberal, more or less laissez-faire sensibility. To study the history of the subject, however, is to realize that comparative literature is ultimately not so much about policing borders as crossing them. Comparatists choose to distance themselves from their own native cultures. They choose not to belong to any one particular tradition. Indeed, this unbelonging is arguably their defining characteristic. As intellectual émigrés, comparatists make links between cultures, but in doing so, they also, paradoxically, reinforce the distinctions between those cultures. As such, the contrasts are as important as the comparisons, the disconnections as instructive as the connections. But why, one might ask, do such metaphors matter? Why should you, care about how comparative literature views itself? The answer lies not in specialist skirmishes, but in common sense. For in the case of comparative literature, the metaphors it lives by are arguably as important as the insights it makes possible. Unlike other disciplines, historically more secure in their intellectual and institutional status, comparative literature must constantly renew its sense of mission, constantly tell itself a new story about how and why literature should be compared. It is the continuous need to justify itself to itself that marks out comparative literature as uniquely beholden to changing intellectual fashions, and thus to changing disciplinary metaphors. So what we might provisionally take the adjective comparative to convey is that the idea of comparison, in conjunction with the idea of literature, is as important as its practice. The animating impulse of comparative literature is not just the urge to take a broad perspective across differing forms and languages of literary expression. It is also the politically, ethically, and aesthetically charged notion that this is a worthwhile undertaking in the first place. Comparative literature cannot get by, in other words, without a pinch of pathos, since it is the utopian dream of being in no place, utopos, and thus in every place, that drives it. Comparative literature is in fact defined by its strategic position between languages, literatures, and culture. Literary theory, cultural studies, post-colonialism, world literature, translation studies, reception studies. Comparative literature in the 21st century draws on all these disciplines and more. Out of these points of intersection emerge a number of recurring debates. The changing notions of high and popular culture, the shifting hierarchy of original and translated texts, concepts and criticisms of the canon. Debates that make comparative literature among the most dynamic of intellectual fields. Irrigated by any number of sources, it overflows with ideas as to how to conceive the role and purpose of the verbal arts in an ever more visual world. For this, indeed, is perhaps the principal function of comparative literature in the 21st century. For ambitious readers with an appetite for ranging beyond their own native traditions, comparative literature is the natural home. Yet, it is also the natural home for all those big questions about why literature, and by extension culture, still matters. To compare literatures and cultures must be to do more than merely accrue the sum of their parts. It must be to ponder and to protect cultural relations. The surest way of moving beyond a purely subjective response to the Rorschach test is to study the practice, the history, and the theory of comparative literature. Thank you very much for your attention.